As our speakers are coming up to the stage here, Warren Nystrom, one of our elders, pointed out that this month's issue of World Magazine is devoted to this issue of transgenderism, how the transgender push hurts those it purportedly helps, forgotten victims. And there is actually an article on Walt Heyer and his former transitioning to a woman and then transitioning back once he came to know the Lord. And so this is an issue that you might look up there. And also, as we get started, and you guys are maybe developing some questions on your own, Andrew, yesterday you and I had a really interesting discussion. We were talking about the differences between homosexuality itself and transgenderism. Could you maybe just expand upon the distinction that is to be made?
Sure. So everyone wants to kind of lump LGBT together, which as an acronym and as a movement, I understand. There's a lot of distinctions, though. The first of which is if you, for example, are a lesbian woman, you may have no problem identifying as a woman. So that you're simply a woman who's involved in a romantic relationship with another woman. So it's a question of your sexual desires. It's a question of how you're using your body. The transgender phenomenon is, it's at a much deeper subterranean level than homosexuality, because it's asking the question not just of what is our sexual desire or how do we use our body sexually. It's whether or not man has a fixed human nature. It's whether we can look at a fellow human in the eyes and say, you are designed to be a man or a woman. What's really fascinating, I found, I think Texas actually had a controversy in the last 3 months about a transgendered wrestler.
Right.
I wrote an article at National Review about this, and my main argument was, if we go down this path, then we're really saying there's nothing intrinsic or fixed to being a male or a female. So you actually end up undermining the whole foundation of human nature altogether. So that if I can become a woman, then there is no such thing as womanhood. Dove soap just has a new commercial out where it has two moms, and one of the moms is an obvious biological male. And I thought to myself, then there's nothing actually unique and intrinsic to motherhood. Motherhood doesn't really exist if a man can step into so-called femaleness and become a woman. So you're actually nullifying the very grounds of what it means to be a man or a woman or a mother or a father.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting in light of what you just said there. Several years ago, when the Obama administration issued that directive from the Department of Education along with the Justice Department and was reinterpreting the meaning of sex in Title IX, many commented that essentially will end up hurting women. In other words, to expand the meaning of a woman to include a male who self-identifies as a woman, means now there are no special protections for women, let's say, in higher education.
And this comes back to what I said yesterday about one of the ways we talk about this with our neighbors is to expose the inconsistencies. So feminism and transgenderism are not allies right now. There probably are some that are allies somewhere, but you had a famous feminist, Germaine Greer. A famous feminist, Germaine Greer, who was being awarded a doctorate, an honorary doctorate, and to speak at a commencement. And it was found out that as a ardent secular feminist, she was not in favor of the transgender movement because she thinks it nullifies the advances in the actual essence of womanhood. And she was treated, she might as well be a fundamentalist Christian by the media standards if she disagreed with the transgender movement. And so it's just, there's an example of progressivism. It ends up eating its own.
That's right. I think Camille Paglia is a similar example of that, who is a lesbian who is not sympathetic to the transgender issues there that are related there. Another one that, just as people are maybe formulating their own questions here, as I read your article, your joint article in rebuttal to National Geographic's issue there, I kept thinking of several fallacies of thinking that you guys were alluding to throughout. In fact, you sometimes even pointed them out. One of them, that you didn't name it by this, but you're suggesting this, is the is-ought fallacy. That is a guide to what ought to be. Can you maybe comment on that? I know, who is it, who's the worldview teacher down at Houston Baptist, a female, Nancy Piercy. She has talked a lot about the is-ought fallacy. Can you guys maybe comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, if from a Christian worldview, it's a fallacy, right? It's a fallacy in terms of a philosophical, logical fallacy. But I would also want to point out it's a theological fallacy, because not everything that we see in nature means that's the way that things are supposed to be. And unfortunately, Christians have gotten this wrong a lot of times, and we've sort of fallen into this. But just because something is broken naturally doesn't mean it's supposed to be broken, okay? And so a lot of people, like when it comes to sexual orientation, for instance, just because a person naturally feels sexual desires for a person of the same sex doesn't mean that that's right. Just because it is, and perhaps they've felt that way for as long as they can remember, they were quote unquote born that way, that doesn't mean that it's natural. So it doesn't mean it's what ought to be, as it were. And I think that Christians have kind of gotten these things confused over the years. And if you'll remember, I think, I don't know, the 90s, a lot of the 2000s, a lot of Christians were really resistant to the idea that a person could be born gay. Now, I would say we don't know what makes a person gay. Can't give a biological explanation for it. The scientists are all over the place on this. However, from a Christian worldview, that is what actually we would expect. We come broken out of the box, all of us. And we have varieties of brokenness, and we can have varieties of broken desires right out of the box that feel quite natural to us. And the Christian worldview says, yeah, that's what we are. But just because we come broken out of the box doesn't mean that that's right. In other words, just because something feels natural doesn't make it right, because we're naturally fallen, because we're deeply connected to our father Adam. So for me, the is-ought fallacy has, we haven't gotten that right. We took the world's assumption that just because something occurs in nature or is, therefore it must be right. And so Christians resisted this idea of deeply inborn, unchosen feelings and said, no, this must be a chosen thing only, or else you can have no moral culpability. Baloney. That's not what we believe. We believe that we are sinners by nature and by choice, and that's so important for us to get. So
sure. And so even if, tell me if I'm right, even if it was established that there was some genuine, specific biological basis for, let's say, transgenderism. Let's say the brain research points out that there's some portion of the brain that actually just codes for this kind of orientation. That doesn't authenticate this.
No,
we still are, as you suggested yesterday, we are accountable to the Word of God that speaks with clarity on the issue of maleness and femaleness.
Now, even if there were a genetic condition that were proven,
right,
that predisposed people to be transgender or homosexual or whatever, that wouldn't be evidence of God's intention and what's right. It would be evidence of how broken we are. And so in other words, our theology is ready for whatever pathology they come up with. The world is broken, and it affects our bodies, it affects our minds, it affects all of us. So none of those things should be surprising to us. But what I saw was Christians fighting tooth and nail. When somebody said, oh, I was born this way, we said, no, you chose to be that way. When really we were giving a superficial account of the human condition that doesn't correspond to what we actually believe. And it didn't ring true to people, and we really had a better word and an explanation for their feelings.
Well, but I'm going to take a little bit of an issue with here, and you kind of push back at me also. I think what happened is that we saw much of the popular media advocating for what was simply false. namely that there is in fact a gay gene, or that they have in fact discovered a biological basis or a genetic basis for, let's say, homosexuality or transgenderism, and that was not the case. Even when you read these articles and you dig down into the details, even they said, they acknowledged that there was not any genetic basis or biological basis. So there was a sense in which, wait a minute, that's not true. That's not true.
We were being propagandized.
Yes.
It's not true.
It's
like I was saying last night, the brain sex theory, that is not a scientific consensus. Now, we're being presented with it as if it is. And the letter that I received from that mother, she is totally bought into that. But if you just scratch at the surface of the literature, you find out that is not what's true. So, but having said that, even if it were true,
Exactly.
it wouldn't undermine our moral evaluation or the biblical evaluation at all. So I'm just wanting us to be aware of the propaganda and be aware that what they are telling us, the implications of the propaganda, actually isn't the case.
Good, good. Questions? Anyone out here? Yes.
Coming off your discussion right now, I want to raise the issue that was an argument, even the one you were referring to. Is this nature that causes this, or is it nurture? And for instance, I was not born wired to speak English. I was taught to be an English-speaking, thinking person. So there's obviously a nurturing that affected very much of who I am. How do you see this working out? And let me add to that, on the nature part of it, my biology, my hardwired biology, when that is distorted, you called it intersex, I think, or hermaphroditic situations. How do you handle that, or what's your perspective on that?
So I have a chapter in my book on what is the meaning of sex that deals with this, on gender. I think this is a very important question. I'm very surprised that nobody asked about it last night. I'll start off with a story here. One day I was speaking at a conference on campus at Southern Seminary. This youth minister comes up to me. I was talking about gender confusion, and a youth minister comes up to me afterwards, and he says, I've got this student in our youth ministry. It's a girl, and she's wanting to identify as a boy. I think I have the order correct. Yeah, it's a girl wanting to become a boy. And I'm thinking, oh, I know. I'm about to quote to him Genesis and tell him about the male-female binary. And, he says, but this child was born with a condition where the genitalia was ambiguous. It wasn't clearly male or female. And this was several years ago, and I went, oh. and the truth of the matter was, I knew what the Bible said, but I had never heard of that, and I didn't know much about it at all, and it threw me for a loop. And it's a part of the reason that I wrote the book that I wrote, because I wanted to understand what these conditions were. So they are called intersex conditions. Intersex is not one condition. It's a word that we use to refer to a range of disorders of sex development. And there are a number of different ones, but what they typically have in common is some sort of atypical presentation of the genitalia. So when a kid is born, usually the doctor can take a look and say it's a boy or it's a girl. For a certain small percentage of individuals, when they're born, you can't do that, because their reproductive anatomy is atypical. And a lot of times it's due to chromosomal abnormalities. And so the reason that intersex becomes important is not because there's a ton of people that are experiencing this. It's a small number of people. But it's used as a defeater for the argument that we've been making here, which is that male and female bodies are a part of God's revelation of what he intends for us in nature. And there's that basic binary. Intersex conditions are brought out to say, no, there's not male and female binary. There's sex is on a spectrum. You have male and female and other things in between. And so if male and female bodies aren't a binary, you can't treat gender as if it's a binary. binary. So that's where that's where this comes in. So it's important to kind of understand what these conditions are. And I'll just say this. In the 1950s, there was a guy named John Money who was a doctor, and he pioneered a treatment for kids born with intersex conditions. And it was really bad because what he said was he bought into the ideology that gender was just a social construct. So it's just a set of learned behaviors. There's nothing essential about being male or female. Therefore, if you have a child born with an intersex condition and they have atypical gender reproductive anatomy, what you should do is take a look at what you have to work with anatomically, reshape that anatomy to be either male or female, and just what you decide to shape it as surgically is just dependent on what you have to work with. If you got enough there to make more of a male, then make a male. If you have enough there to make a female, make more of a female. And so he said, it's basically pick a sex, pick a gender, and go with it. And the doctors and the parents would make that decision, and then they would raise that child and express no ambiguity about what they had done. The problem was, even though these kids had gender atypical reproductive anatomy, they still had an underlying chromosomal structure. And a lot of these kids grew up to feel themselves different than what the doctors and the parents chose. And the reason was because they ignored the underlying biological chromosomal realities. And so this youth minister that came up to me, what he was dealing with was a child that had an underlying chromosomal reality, and the parents and doctor chose against it, surgically reshaped against the chromosomal reality, and then the child felt different when they grew up. That's not transgenderism. That's a child feeling themselves to be what they actually were at the beginning, but because of the brokenness of creation, it led to a brokenness of sexual development, and because of an ideology that gender is a social construct, it led the parents and the surgeons to do something. So there's actually a group now called the Intersex Society of North America. They're against these surgeries. They're more of a liberal group, but I'm actually against those surgeries too. And it's kind of fallen out of favor now. And if you talk to most clinicians, what they will say is, a growing number of clinicians, I should say, is when you look at the underlying, even if you have a gender atypical anatomy, if you look at the underlying chromosomal condition, there is either the presence of a Y or not. Okay, so you could have, the normal chromosomal situation is for females XX and for males XY, right? You can have an XXY, you can have XXYY, you can have, and each of these have different names associated with them. But there's either a Y or not, and the Y is what scripts the reproductive anatomy towards a certain outcome. Sometimes it can be broken, but the presence of the Y is what scripts that. And so even if it's invisible to the naked eye, the binary, I think chromosomally, the binary is not invisible. Does that make sense? So our inability to see that doesn't make it not so. Do you understand what I'm saying? Now, the question then becomes, we live in a first world country, we have modern medicine, we can see through to the chromosomes, through chromosomal testing and all that. That hasn't been the case in the history of the world. And it's certainly not the case in other places in the world that can't determine those things. They're just looking at a child with atypical anatomy. What are we supposed to do? And this is where I think it's important for us to say, the scripture speaks about this. Jesus talked about this. He talked about those who were eunuchs for the kingdom, those who were made eunuchs by men, and he said that there are those who are eunuchs from birth. In other words, they are born with no reproductive capacity due to some sort of reproductive abnormality from birth. And he doesn't rule them outside of the kingdom. In other words, just because some of these things in a broken world may be invisible to the naked eye, it doesn't mean that you can't follow Jesus. It might mean that you aren't able to get married and to reproduce and all of that, but it doesn't mean that you're unable to follow Jesus. But that doesn't erase the gender binary, because in the same passage where Jesus talks about those who are eunuchs from birth, he reaffirms Genesis 1. Have you not read that in the beginning God made them male and female? So intersex is often brought out as a defeater of our position, but it's not. It's not. It's not evidence of how God made the world. It's evidence of how the world has been broken because of sin.
I'm going to add one thing to that. As Denny mentioned, intersex is used as a way to basically say that sex and gender are on spectrums. But I'll pose a question. If someone is born missing a right arm, is that a new class of humanity, of one-armed humans, or would we say they're simply a deviation from the norm? So the fact that there are individuals born with medical abnormalities and physical abnormalities doesn't nullify the fact that the gender binary is still the overriding norm 99.9% of the time. It's simply a deviation from the norm.
Right.
Hey, can I say one more thing, Charles?
Sure.
Be sensitive to folks if you ever meet somebody that's gone through this, because some of them had surgeries done on them when they were babies, and it diminished their potential for sexual relations, for feeling things. And so, in other words, some of these people have been broken by this. And even though that treatment protocol has gone away, there are still people among us who have had that done to them. And it's a very painful and sad thing. And there are some who didn't have that, but who nevertheless have the disorder of sex development. And it really should just arouse our compassion and wanting to be there for them more than anything else. But it's important for us not to confuse those intersex conditions with transgenderism. In transgenderism, the biological situation is clear. In other words, there's no disorder of sex development underlying. It's a sense of self that's out of sync with an otherwise biologically clear male or female.
Andrew, you had mentioned Jesus' perfect example of full of grace and truth, and how we should seek to emulate that in the way that we respond to individuals with a compassion, with just a pastoral sensitivity. And yet, sadly, at times, we as Christians sometimes don't respond appropriately, and we react, and maybe sometimes out of frustration and not knowing the answer, we just simply speak louder or more forcefully, and we're not sensitive. What is the path for a Christian to more faithfully emulate Jesus' perfect harmony between grace and truth? The path to that. How do we get like that?
Great question. So I would say there's a sense in which you have to practice humility. And from that, you have to learn that we all share in a similar common nature that unites all of us together in a Genesis 3 world. And that sense of commonality that we all share a broken nature, I sense would humble the person in such a way as they don't feel that they need to treat someone else's conditions as so totally unlike their own. Practically speaking, you need to examine what your habits are on a daily basis about what types of social media feeds you're exposing yourself to, whether they are particularly very hard right sources versus much more pastorally kind sources. You need to pay attention, if you're on social media, to the conversation that's happening in your orbit and the conversation you're participating in. And I would say, lastly, one of the great challenges here is there are so few transgender individuals statistically that it makes getting to know individuals like this more difficult, because it's hard to seek out in the population. Are you transgender? Are you trans? You don't ask those types of questions. But I've gotten to know, I shouldn't say gotten to know, I have a couple acquaintances that have one struggle with gender identity and is a follower of Christ and is living faithfully, and then another person who is fully identifying as transgender and has transitioned. There's a sense in which if you actually incarnationally meet someone face to face and hear them, you begin to understand that despite really stern disagreement, we are still humans, and we still have the same fallen natures. We all have the same hopes and aspirations, and that should just kind of calm us and temper us from being too strident, is what I would say. He's going to quote the Bible and make me feel bad now.
No. When I was, several years ago, one of my best friends from high school came out to me as a homosexual. And I kind of suspected it over the years. I'd seen things on Facebook, but he kind of confirmed it. And it led to a series of conversations, opportunities for witness, and then debate about things. And he knows I'm a Christian, and he knows where I stand on these things. And we just kind of went back and forth on these things. And one of the things that came back over and over was how he felt not loved, and in particular by the church that we were a part of when we were kids. And he said, in particular by me. And he said, even though we were best friends, I didn't know about all that. I mean, we're one of my best friends. I didn't know about all this when we were in high school. But he said, you used to make these jokes, gay jokes, and you were harsh. And I had no clue what he was talking about. I said, what are you talking about? And he told me. And I remembered. I hadn't thought about it in 20 or 30 years. I did say that. I had no idea that that's what he was, but I did say that. And there I was, his Christian friend. And I think the reason I'm saying this is because I think in our circles and in conservative churches, we've created a culture where it's, oh, you're an alcoholic. We got a special small group for you. We're going to work with you. You've got all kinds of sinners you're willing to deal with, but we kind of treated these LGBT things as, and we can openly mock you and make fun of you. And if there's a ministry for you, we're going to farm you out. There's not a ministry for you at the church. And we've sort of stood apart. Well, and they felt that. And so there kind of needs to be a culture change in our communities to say, look, our arms are wide open. And the reason I opened up the scripture was because I'm going to talk about this tomorrow in the Sunday school I'm doing. But in 1 Timothy 1, Paul says, he says, we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, realizing the fact that law is not made for a righteous man, but for those who are lawless and rebellious, ungodly sinners, those who are unholy, profane, those who kill their fathers and mothers. And he goes on and he says, for immoral men and for homosexuals. And his long list of all these sinners. And it's awful, okay? And then Paul says, it is a trustworthy statement, deserving full acceptance, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, among whom I am the foremost of all. He just said kidnappers, homosexuals, people who murder their fathers. And I am the foremost of all. I just don't think that we've had that spirit about us. This idea that, listen, we ought to be most amazed that God saved us. We don't have a leg up on anybody. Okay? And we just need to have a kind of humility about things that I think it's not there when there's gay jokes and when there's scornfulness towards those on the outside. Listen, people are sinners and people are broken, and we have got to have a gospel that touches every sinner. And we have to have our arms open to sinners, all kinds of different sinners. And we have to have a different culture in our churches that isn't so culture war-y that we can't engage with sinners anymore. So I feel burdened about that because I have just seen things in my own life that have needed to change. And I think that I'm a microcosm of things that need to change in our churches more broadly.
Wow, that's very powerful. In fact, as I listened to both of you speak about on this issue, the question that prompted it, how can we be more like Jesus, who is full of grace and truth? I mean, I think of just simply immersing ourselves in the scripture that really washes us, and we learn from the example of a Jesus as we view his life. We learn from a Paul, like you just explained there, and I think of, was it Luke 6:45, the good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth what is good. And that if we would seek to speak what is good, we wash ourselves, we immerse ourselves in the sanctifying words of Holy Scripture. Yeah. Do we have, yes?
I work in this situation. So some of my colleagues are transgender, several are homosexual. One of my classmates said, my moms are getting married this weekend, so that's what I live with every day. So I really appreciate what you're sharing because it's affirming the things that I've already discovered. But I do want to point out two things. One, many of the transgender people are desperate for relief. I mean, that's a really good word. I've heard them be called courageous, but they're not courageous. They're just so desperate. So we need to remember that in our compassion. Also, many of them fear for their lives, if somebody else would know. So when they read things in the news about what's happening, they are afraid because they don't have the hope of Christ. They don't know that he'll walk through them. The other thing, which I find kind of curious, it's another inconsistency with society, is society is really pushing evolution, neo-Darwinism. Transgender and homosexual and everything is totally opposite to a belief in evolution because those things aren't good for reproduction. So that's just some comments that I haven't heard you make to keep in mind.
Yeah. I mean, evolution should have selected out some of these features if there was, in fact, a physical basis for this. But like you've suggested, I think, even if there is discovered some physical basis, it really doesn't alter the believer's understanding of these things, that we are fallen individuals and that in fact, we might even expect some physiological basis or physical basis for the transference of sin down from Adam to us in light of our understanding theologically of how we are all born into sin. Now, I'm not suggesting that is the case. I haven't resolved that issue, but I mean, yeah. Yes.
You mentioned a minute ago that transgender euphoria is deeper in the body and in the mind and the heart. Is it deeper than the alcoholism issue that we deal with, or other issues of adultery and sexual preference and that type of thing?
So I would be interested to get your thoughts on this. I think I would cautiously and with an asterisk place sexual desires in a different category than these types of conditions that we discussed over here. So depression, psychological states, anorexia. So gender identity disorder, gender dysphoria, they all fall in the same psychological category in the DSM-5, this manual, along the same lines of anorexia nervosa, body integrity, identity disorder. So I think that these are not necessarily, I mean, they are desires on the one hand. I think we need to keep that word, but they are psychological states, I would say first and foremost. So I would be, at this point, I would categorize them a little bit differently. I don't know what you would say.
Well, I just think that the biblical framework, it just gives us the best framework for thinking about these things. When we say we're sinners by nature and by choice, all we mean by that is we were brought forth in iniquity and conceived in sin. We are by nature children of wrath. It means our desiring is broken. It means our self-perception is broken. It means everything about us is broken. And that's something that we all have in common. That's what total depravity is. What gets confusing, and what we're talking about here is that we have different expressions of that basic fallenness. And so that's going to come out in some people with various forms of addiction. And it's going to have, some people are going to have identity issues, sexual identity issues. Some people are going to have all kinds of desirings that they can't account for, but there they are. It's just, in other words, the way that the flesh expresses itself in individuals is just multifarious. And but what's at the root of it is the fact that we're all descended from Adam. We are fallen, and as I said before, we're broken out of the box. And so none of this surprises us. So in one sense, in the deepest and most theological sense, we're kind of all in the same boat. I'm not saying that all sins are equal. I'm saying they all come from the same root. Okay, and that's what I mean. We're all coming from the same place here, and there's only one way to fix it, ultimately. I mean, we can curb things through laws and all these other things, but there's really only one way to fix it because we're so crooked deep down. We have to have the cleansing blood of Jesus to change us and to shape us, or else we're stuck. And that goes for the legalist who's been sitting in church for 20 years, who doesn't need Jesus, and it goes for the guy over here who's got a gender identity disorder, who thinks he doesn't need Jesus. Their sins and issues have different consequences and different effects, and we don't say that they're equal in that sense, but they have the same root. And that same basic fallenness is our basic problem that we need help with. And it just so happens to be what we have to offer the world a remedy for. And that's what we can't forget. And I just want Christians to have the confidence that the gospel is sufficient for all these things. And whether or not you understand the DSM or read our books or whatever, I still think God saves powerfully through his word and through just the ordinary witness of Christians. And you can have great confidence in that and know that God is going to do surprising, powerful things just through you being the church and bearing witness.
You both have talked about how in our day people are justifying this whole issue of transgenderism. Do you have any thoughts about the path to today? How is it that our culture has come to this point? Through what means? Through what venues has this been facilitated? What breakdowns? What moral categories were changed? I mean, I think of one, just the creation of even the idea of gender as distinct from sex. I mean, using the term gender seems like a false way of talking about the realities that the Bible describes. But I mean, the arts, how did we get here? What aspects of society really made this possible?
Andrew's book has a whole chapter that tells us how we got here. Why don't you tell us?
Thanks, Denny. So, I mean, you can look, we do ourselves a major disservice if we pinpoint it to simply one thing. It's a factor of things. You can look to the fact that we are heading into an increasingly post-Christian age, as I mentioned that last night. So the displacement of the kind of Christian moral order of society is being displaced by a secular moral order. And the secular moral order is not neutral in its views towards the Christian sexual ethic. It's actually being seen as opposed to the Christian sexual ethic. You can look to the sexual revolution, which the sexual revolution, depending on when you want to define it or when it began, but basically in the 1950s onward, you had through different sets of situations, a radical disruption of the natural family unit. You had the onslaught of feminism in the 60s and 70s. You have a postmodern culture where postmodernism, highly complex concept, but in the end, it's basically I get to write my own script. There are no grand master narratives. There are only smaller narratives. And if you impose your narrative on me, that's really just a power play on me. So we're all self-autonomous actors engaging in a marketplace of options and ideas. I think you can look, there's a little bit of consumerism in here. We become what we love, if you follow Augustine. And so we have an idealized view of what we can become as humans, and we try to go beyond our natural physical boundaries and physical limits and grasp for things that we're not meant to be grasped at. And then I think, too, regarding the LGBT component of this, regarding the homosexuality component in particular, is homosexuality begins to ask this question of what is our nature? How are we to direct our sexual desires towards any particular ends? So as Denny said last night, there's always been an understood telos, or a goal, or an end, through which we view kind of our life script. That telos and that script has been turned over so that we can kind of write our own script. But back to the LGBT component of this, that human nature is elastic, that we can play with it, that there's nothing fixed about it. So if there's nothing fixed about our sexual desires in terms of them being directed either homosexual or heterosexual, then why can't I redirect my sense of gender and my sense of self? So that's where I would say probably 1950s onward. We could probably trace some roots of this.
And if you put in there just the idea from modernity that we're individual, self-determining agents, if you put all that together with the sexual revolution, what you have is a new set of presuppositions in the world that didn't exist before the late modern secular West. But kind of the perspective that you see now is, I see three main things out of this when you take all these influences together that people take as sort of an assumption today, and it hasn't always been that way. But people think that gender is something you learn, it's not something that you are. In other words, gender is just a set of cultural habits, learned behaviors. There's no intrinsic connection between maleness and femaleness in biology. So gender is just something you learn. It's not something you are, and it's infinitely malleable. The other thought is, especially coming out of the sexual revolution, is that sex is for pleasure. It's not for God. In other words, the end point of sex is just whatever floats your boat. And there is no, there are no guardrails. There are no rules today on sexual behavior, except for two things. Except for one thing. You can't hurt anybody. If you don't hurt anybody, whatever you want to do sexually is fine. So as long as you don't hurt anybody, sky's the limit. And that's not how the way things have always been in the secular West. I mean, in the Christian West. In the Christian West, sex was thought of as something that God had given us, and it had a certain end. The third major thing is that marriage, this idea that marriage is what we make it and not what God has made it. So marriage is defined by culture. It's not defined by God. And so marriage becomes this infinitely malleable thing as well. And it's just a lifestyle choice, and we can determine and redetermine the nature of it in any way we want. So you have all these forces of post-Christendom, relativism, secularism. They're all coming together, and they've given us a whole different view of the human person and of our sexual natures. And the things that are taken for granted today that we're just swimming in like fish is kind of new in the world, but here we are.
I think we've seen it in this last campaign, a lot of churches being forced, including ours, to now speak out on more political issues, and yet trying not to equate our kingdom, the kingdom of God, with the kingdoms of political power. And yet it's almost impossible for Christians now, if we're going to try to, have an influence in our culture, not to be somewhat political. Do y'all see some inherent dangers in that for the church, or more opportunities?
I mean, I think it's both. Andrew and I both follow politics very closely, and these things are fascinating to us. We talk about them all the time. But in the same way, though, I'm a pastor at a church, and I do feel that my first responsibility when I get behind that pulpit is to preach God's word and to bear witness to a kingdom that's above all other kingdoms. And so, we have to be wise and prudent, and sometimes I'm going to whiff it. Sometimes I'll get it wrong, and sometimes, we're all going to mess up on these things, and we're just going to need to help each other. But I do think that we need to keep in mind what our transcendent, unique contribution to the world is, and it's not on telling America how to balance the budget. I know there's a lot of prudential things that are important, that are morally implicated, but they're not the main thing, and they can get us off mission. And so I have to be careful about that. I think our churches have to be careful about that, especially as we become more and more of a minority. I don't want us to get in a defensive posture where it's just, fighting about politics and the gospel gets lost in it.
On the way down here, on the flight yesterday, I was reading a journal article, and there was a quote from the great St. Augustine. Anyone here familiar with Augustine? 5th century bishop in North Africa. And he wrote a famous treatise called The City of God. And he has a quote in there that I just loved. He said, make use of the peace of the Babylonians. Or make use of the peace of Babylon. There we go. And I like that a lot, because Augustine had this understanding. He was living in the midst of the tumult of the decline of the Roman Empire. He was seeing it sacked. The Christian order in his context was heavily under siege. But he says, make use of the peace of Babylon. And what he means by that is there are opportunities for us as Christians to partake in the civic realm that can be served to your advantage, but also the advantage of your neighbors. And Augustine actually cites back to Jeremiah 29, seek the welfare of your city. And then he also cites to 1 Timothy 2, to pray for those in authority so that we may lead quiet and godly lives. So there's this to me, the New Testament and Augustine, they have a very kind of instrumental view of politics, that politics is not an absolute good and end in and of itself. It's to steward and further something. It's to further the human flourishing, the social welfare, but it's not everything in the purview of the Christian. So that means to me, get involved, vote, advocate, stay informed, be an educated voter, but understand that there are going to be limits to the ability of politics to get things done in the world. And if we invest all of our hopes in politics, we are going to be very, very defeated people, and we're going to be very upset and angry people when we cling to that as our hope. So to me, there's a sense in which the proper response, or the proper kind of heart posture in politics, is kind of resigned participation. That we're going to participate, and we're going to have our voice heard, but we're going to understand, we're going to put politics in its proper place in perspective, and to know what we really can achieve out of it.
And I wonder if maybe some of the hysteria and the aftermath of political changes has come from an idol, that some have made government God. And so if their God, or at least their version of God, is destabilized or toppled, then this is like a catastrophic event, and it requires hysteria and violence and a whole range of really irrational responses. But the Christian has that source of stability, and whatever happens in the political arena, God is still on the throne, and his kingdom will endure, and we're going to win in the end. And he's coming back, and a whole range of the Christian truths. Maybe a couple more, and yes.
I'm a school nurse in a high school level, 9th and 10th grade, and this is my 17th year. I've watched a decline in our culture and our kids that's just catastrophic. There's more mental illness, which you would call mental illness, depression, anxiety, panic attacks. It's just accelerating because what the culture is providing for them is a lifestyle that doesn't work. I have homosexuals are miserable, having panic attacks and breakdowns in the bathrooms. I go pick them up. I ask them, how did you get here? One of my lesbian girls says, I got here because you know, Miss Workman, if you don't get a boyfriend by the 8th grade, that means you're a lesbian. I mean, you have no idea what's going on with our teens. My lesbians are not happy. My homosexuals are unhappy. My transgenders, I had a little girl transgender. She's miserable. It's not working for them. We owe them the gospel. We really owe it to them. I give it to them because I can say I'm a conservative with a liberal amount of love. I love you to pieces. But I'm a conservative. And I'll tell you what, if you want to know what I believe and why I'm so happy here, I believe in Jesus Christ as personal Savior. I'm going to tell you about it. I've been doing this for 17 years. They haven't fired me yet, but they have a privilege to do that if they want to. I've been called into accountability for not being professional because I'm not politically correct. We are killing our generations with political correctness. Just stand up for the truth as your opinion. You can do it. You can do it wherever you are. You have a right to freedom of speech. Why we Christians do not do that? If you love people like God loves them, you will stand up. Look at the disciples. They got crucified. They got beheaded. They stood up. Why can we not stand up? I don't get it.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me when you hear people talk about actual lives of people. It's brokenness. This is not the gateway to freedom. The sexual revolution will not fulfill the promises it's made. And we're, as Andrew said, we're going to be dealing with the aftermath and the refugees of the sexual revolution. But we should be just prepared for that. And we're not helping people if we grease the skids and just affirm whatever it is they choose to be or to do. Love is going to require truth and trying to help people so that they can get out of the situation they're in. Can I tell one story here? Are we being recorded? Okay, I'll try to keep this anonymous. Very well-known doctor was telling me a story of something that happened at one of the schools in the A&M system here in Texas. Boy, raised in a Christian home, goes to A&M, and within his first year, he gets in a relationship with a girl, and they move in together. They just begin committing sexual immorality. He's totally walking away from the faith. But here he is, this Christian kid in this long-term sexual relationship with this girl. And she is enthralled with 50 Shades of Grey and wants to redo this script that she's seen in 50 Shades of Grey. He doesn't want to. And so they determine that he needs to go see a counselor, and they go and see the counselor at the school, who is beholden to this gender stuff. And the counselor determined, you may not really be a male. Your unwillingness to do this means that you're probably not, you may be having some gender identity issues. And so basically got diagnosed by this school counselor as having gender identity conflicts. And as a result of that counselor and some others, they put him on hormone blockers and began to start a transition. It's a college kid. This is post-pubescent, right? And the guy just got more sad, more upset, more depressed. This did not help him at all. But he was perceived as having gender identity conflicts because he wouldn't do this perverted sexual script. And so anyway, this well-known doctor who is against all of these things said this guy was finally referred to a physician, I think down in Houston, who was a disciple of this well-known doctor, who said, "You're not a woman. You're a man, and just because you don't want to do these preferred things doesn't make you having a gender." It took him off the hormone blockers, and the guy's fine. But what I'm trying to say is that the ideology is scripting into people into self-destructive paths, and it's not going to help them. And even the ones that feel like they need to go through these paths, it's not going to pay off in the end. And we're just going to see story after story after story after story, and we're just going to have to be there and ready to deal with it. Because you know what? The world is not going to pick up those pieces. When the people like this who desist and who don't live out what the ideology of the sexual revolutionaries say that they have to live out, when they don't do it and they're broken, they're going to want to suppress their stories and suppress their brokenness because it doesn't fit their narrative. Who's going to be there to pick up the pieces if it's not us?
Yeah, so one of the things that we see over and over is just a cultural flooding, and specifically, I guess language is one thing that you see over and over again. So the question is, kind of a drill down as well, is how do we, I hate to say the word fight, that sounds so negative, but how do you fight that, just the constant barrage of language, and real specifically, and I know that you've written on this before, specifically the gender pronoun, how do we walk that out just real specifically as people are introducing themselves? "Hi, I'm so-and-so, I identify this, and here's what I want you to call me," pronoun-wise.
So I've got lots of thoughts on this one. I'll get to the pronouns in a second.
Do we even agree on this?
I think we do.
Well, let's find out.
Yeah, we'll find out. So I think we actually have to be very, very careful with our use of the term transgender and cisgender. Because, frankly speaking, there is no such thing as transgender. Someone who's a boy can't become a girl, and vice versa. That label itself is a cultural construct. So it's a philosophical construct to describe an entirely fictional reality. And the same thing goes for using the terms like cisgender. Because when we...
Have you heard that term? Maybe you should...
Cisgender means that my gender identity and my biological sex are in alignment. So when we use words like transgender and validate those words, it then puts individuals like us in a new category called cisgender. And that's an artificial category. And we should not be willing to use words like cisgender to describe reality. Yeah. So we need to be careful that the use of the language is not unwittingly or unintentionally validating the category. And in fact, my book is called God and the Transgender Debate. And it's titled that way for a particular purpose. But I have a section in there where I simply say, really, I don't like to use the word transgender very often because it validates a category that doesn't really exist. On the use of pronouns, my approach is avoid them at all cost. I think it's fair to say that the times that you'd have to use someone's pronoun in front of them are pretty rare. Secondly, I don't see a problem in using their preferred name simply because names they mean different things in different cultures. So these are kind of like a hierarchy of how I would rank these. Using their preferred name, I don't think is highly problematic. I do not find it, let me back up. If I were meeting someone, upon meeting them, and they wanted me to use their preferred pronoun, I think it would be very insensitive and unnecessarily provocative upon meeting someone initially and immediately correcting them about their preferred pronoun. To me, there's a level of, I need to develop a friendship with this person and get to know this person before I can have that conversation. Denny has some thoughts. We might disagree here, but try to avoid pronouns altogether. If you can, use a preferred name. And I think, let me also say this. I think this is an area where Christians can disagree on the pronoun usage. And I've talked with a bunch of other big name Christian leaders as well, and they sense there's some room for prudence on this. But I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Well,
Maybe
I mean, my touchstone principle is speak the truth in love. So you gotta love people, and you gotta speak the truth to them, and you don't want to speak untruthfully in a way that's gonna affirm a destructive identity. So that's kind of my touchstone, is to speak the truth in love, Ephesians 4:15. And then also, Romans 12, as far as it is up to you, be at peace with all men. Which means you don't have to pursue every conflict possible in every encounter with people. In other words, you ought to pursue peace as much as you can. So far as it depends on you, to be at peace with all men. So I want to speak the truth, but I want to realize I don't have to have every fight and every encounter that I have with every person. We don't do that with people that we know, right? I think it applies here in this case. So for me, the way I've thought about this, I agree with you that the naming, a person's proper name and then the pronouns are different issues. I would also add, though, your relationship to a person is going to probably determine a certain kind of response. So if I meet somebody that I just met on the street and they tell me that their name is, Emily, and it's obviously a male, Emily's all I have. Okay? However, if one of the elders at the church where I serve decides he's going to transition and leave his wife, and he says, my new name is Emily, I'm not going to accommodate him. And the church is going to call him to repentance. And I'm going to be encouraging him to come back. And I'm not going to accommodate that. So my relationship is kind of determining a certain response on the proper name because I know better and he knows better, and there's accountability that's there. So I can see where differing relationships would call for different. A parent to a child, for instance, is probably going to, determine a different response than somebody you just meet on the street. When it comes to pronouns, I think Andrew is correct. I think you should speak truthfully, so I don't think you should use their preferred pronouns.
Let me press you a little bit on this.
Let me finish one thing.
Yeah.
I don't think you should use preferred pronouns. Having said that, you don't have to pursue this as a conflict. It's just not the main issue. And so when we're speaking to people, you don't have to use gendered pronouns. You can usually go around it. Now, the issue is, and what I found with frankly, people in your church here, my church, is what do we do at work where HR is requiring us to behave a certain way towards other people, and now we have to refer to them in the third person? I'm going to say I still think you shouldn't pursue the conflict at that. I would try to avoid the pronouns as best as I could, but I wouldn't use the preferred pronouns. I wouldn't do the ones that they're asking me to do. I would just use their proper name a lot. Use the possessive form. In other words, that's what I would do. And I would just try not to pursue it as a conflict and to speak truthfully without pursuing the conflict if I don't have to. Because you're going to have eventually conflicts that you have to have. And I don't know that that's the one that's the fight that you need to pick if you don't have to.
And that was my follow-up question, is that
Yeah.
I've had people come into my office, a junior high teacher that said he's being pressured by, in fact, required by his principal to refer to a boy as a girl and use those pronouns and to affirm that, and now what do I do? And so it's in one sense, it's easier to resolve the question of what to do if it's your family, if it's your church, it's an elder that now transitions. It's a very, very difficult thing when it's your livelihood also. I mean, the stakes are very high. Not to be brutally pragmatic, but I mean, when you ask an individual to forfeit their career on the basis of whether or not they use a pronoun or not, that's a really, really difficult question for them.
Two principles. I would say pick your battles wisely.
Right.
And most of all, obey your conscience.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Last question. You both talked about the path to the present and the variety of influences, philosophical changes, how the arts play a role in socializing people different ways, how failure to respond to the sexual revolution, no-fault divorce, a whole range of things, the breakdown of the family. I mean, in light of all of that, your description of the path to the present, can you give us, maybe just succinctly, give us some counsel now on how do you respond to this in this wide variety of ways that brought us to the present? How do we respond?
Yeah, well, I mean, golly, that's a huge question. Man, the church is just going to need to be the church. I think these pressures are just going to force us into it. Undisciplined churches that have not been thinking about manhood and womanhood are going to have to start changing that. You're not going to be able to do gender-neutral parenting anymore because there are cultural reinforcements on manhood and womanhood. Those are gone. So as churches, we're going to have, and as individual families, we're going to have more discipleship in manhood and womanhood, which, by the way, can I say this? This is why our organization exists. It's the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. And traditionally, we've been just trying to provide resources for churches and ministries to know what that is. That's why we exist. In the past, it was mainly about the role of men and women in the home and in the church. But because of these present challenges, we're refocusing our mission to address these more current issues that have really confused everybody. What does it mean to be a male, and what does it mean to be female? Transgenderism, homosexuality. And so we've started a new initiative within CBMW called a Coalition for Biblical Sexuality. There's a new website, cbsexuality.org. And we're trying to clarify these things and to speak biblically to these things and to provide resources for churches. I want you to know about this. If you feel that you can and you want to contribute to this, I want to encourage you to go visit the website, and please do that because this is our work. We're working on a shoestring right now, and we could use all the help that we could get. So, but we're going to have more intentional discipleship and training on what it means to be male and what it means to be female. And we're going to have to get back to the biblical core. I was just talking with a brother here beforehand. Man, you can't reduce manhood to liking Dallas Cowboy football after church on Sundays. Okay, that's not, we're going to have to get to the essence of what the Bible says this is, okay? And we're going to have to distinguish the stereotypes from what's most important. And we're going to have to inculcate that in our children. Until our churches become a counterculture like that in the midst of our culture, our witness is going to be compromised.
I would, and not to end on a horribly dour note, but I'm kind of going to a little bit. We still have a lot of numbers in America. The church does, but a lot of the cultural power that we have has declined greatly, and so I think Christians can deceive themselves into thinking, man, things really aren't that bad. We've got a lot of folks together when we link arms. We do have a lot of folks together when we link arms. But I think we need to begin thinking through, what does it mean to be treated with hostility in the name of Christ? Actual hostility, not physical violence, but hostility. Those are categories. I chose this career. I feel God has called me to it. But I'm already at a place when I meet people out in public, I give the most canned, nondescript response about what I do for a living as possible. Because I'm just not looking to have a conflict and a debate every single time I go out to McDonald's. I just want to go to McDonald's. I'm not ashamed of my convictions, and if they want to have that debate with me and keep asking me questions, I'll go there. But I already take a calculated cost of okay, how much do I want to tell this person what I really believe and what I really do for a living? And we need to begin preparing ourselves for that.
You're a very odious man. I'm just kidding.
That means smelly.
Yeah, no.
I think I just echo the comments that you both have made. In one sense, we're on a steep learning curve. I mean, we have been thrust into a time, we've maybe been caught flat-footed. We've taken a lot of things for granted, and we haven't sufficiently discipled our children. We haven't sufficiently paid attention to just the core beliefs of Christianity. We've stayed superficial. Wow, maybe we just have to gain our voice. We need to find our voice. Maybe as Rod Dreher said, what would it be like if God had thrust it, he'd caused us to be born at this time for this purpose, to simply speak prophetically. I mean, not in a way that's gratuitously offensive, but to speak a message that will encounter hostility. And maybe we're going to discover as believers what Jesus said so long ago: they hated me, therefore they will hate you. And that was always kind of hypothetical. It was kind of like we believed it, but we really didn't experience it. Other generations have experienced it. Other places of the world are experiencing it. And now maybe God has appointed us for this time. And maybe I remember those words of the disciples in the book of Acts. It says they rejoiced because they had been considered worthy to suffer for Christ. And to find the capacity to rejoice in bearing the reproaches of Christ, to fill up that which is lacking in the sufferings of Christ. All of those hypothetical statements that we've kind of assented to, but never really kind of appropriated and made, this is mine. And maybe this pressure, this crisis that we find ourselves in the midst of, is going to be the very things that will stir within the church a new vitality. Maybe our numbers will indeed shrink. Maybe our ability to influence in the courts, in education, we'll lose our jobs. We won't be able to serve there if we're faithful to our testimony. But maybe in the process, there's going to be a fervor and a vitality that the church will find that we just maybe haven't known for a while. Wow. Gentlemen, you guys have been amazing, brought light, clarity in a very difficult issue. Thank you for I know it's a sacrifice for your families to come and travel like this, but know that just the deposits that you've made in our hearts and our lives, and not only those that have been here, but those that will view these resources online, just know that your sacrifices will not go unappreciated. And we greatly appreciate you guys speaking to us. And so would you join me in giving a hand to our speakers? Thank you. And I just think it's appropriate that we maybe end in prayer. And Denny, why don't you just maybe offer up our closing prayer today?
Father, I'm thinking about all the folks in this room, and your people are living and working in Denton, and human resources have expectations of them. Their supervisors have expectations of them. And they're not going to work with a chip on their shoulder, but they've got these conflicts, not that they've sought, but that they're coming to them. I just pray for your people that you'd make them faithful. Help them to speak the truth in love. Help them to, as far as it depends on them, to be at peace with all people. And I pray that you would give opportunities for gospel witness and proclamation, and that you would empower these your servants to tell people that Jesus Christ is crucified and raised for sinners, and that it's for them. And Lord, I pray you would grant amazing fruitfulness to their witness and to their testimonies as they are faithful to proclaim it. So Lord, here's an impossible thing. We can't change people's hearts, but we know you can. So we beg you and ask for your help. And Lord, we pray that you would help us to think rightly about these things, And we pray that you'd make us a Christ culture in the midst of a culture that's going the wrong way. So help us, Lord. And Father, we will trust ourselves and all of these things to you. And we pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.